This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening. 5 minutes past 7 on LBC. Welcome to the show. It's Iain Dale here with you until 10. One of the things that really annoys me about politics is the number of times political leaders feel that they need to relaunch themselves, to set the agenda, to tell the electorate what they're doing and what the targets are and what they're going to achieve, and then conveniently forget them. And this is not something that has happened just in recent years. This has been going on, I would say, probably since John Major's time. I can't remember the Thatcher government did a lot of this sort of malarkey. But Keir Starmer's already at it. After only 5 months, he feels he has to remind us what his missions are. I mean, look, he's been talking today about pillars, foundations, missions, first steps, milestones. What a load of old baloney. I mean, just tell us what you're going to do at the election, and then we'll judge you on it at the next election. We don't need reminding of it every 5 minutes, and we certainly don't need reminding of it when you don't actually stick to what you said during the election campaign. Well, he made a big speech. It was very much vaunted as a big speech on Sunday when I was sitting in for Lewis Goodall. I previewed it with Pat McFadden, the Cabinet Office Minister. And I kept thinking, where's the beef? There's nothing new in this, apart from watering down one or two of the commitments. And I'm just left with the idea that Keir Starmer stands for absolutely nothing. He rode back on every single pledge he made in his leadership campaign to become leader. He's gone back on virtually every pledge. And now he's watering down the pledges that he made in the election. And we're supposed to take him seriously. There's no narrative to this government. You can talk about missions and pillars till the cows come home. But what does it actually mean? What do you think Keir Starmer stands for? And are you, maybe I've totally misinterpreted this speech, quite happy to accept that I have, if you convince me I have, and that's what I want to hear from you over the next hour. 0345 6060 973. Well, Aggie Chambray is here, our political correspondent. Aggie, you were at Pinewood Studios for the Prime Minister's speech today. I mean, he told a really funny joke at the beginning, didn't he? He said, I could be the new James Bond. Unlikely, I would say.
Perhaps unlikely, Ian. Yeah, he made this big speech today. And essentially what this was doing on the face of it was taking the missions that they had before the election, those 5 missions. Are you sure it's not missions. A pillar? I'm very sure it's not a pillar.
In fact, before you start, let me give you a little quiz, Aggie. Could you define for me what is a pillar?
Okay, so a pillar is, Rachel Reeves set out 7 key pillars for economic growth.
Because I always think of a pillar as something from ancient Rome, but okay.
You'd be wrong, Ian.
Okay. What is a foundation?
Okay, so foundation, these are 3 different things whereupon everything is based. So they said their 3 foundations were economic security, border security, and national security. So if you think of it sort of like a grid, I suppose, that's at the very top. So everything flows from that.
Right. So that was me thinking foundation was something that women wear on their faces.
Again, wrong.
Okay, right. Mission.
Mission is, these are sort of the ones that are over 10 years, and this is what the new milestones
Why do I feel like James O'Brien at the moment, giving you a grilling like this?
No, it's okay, I can handle it. So missions are these sort of 10-year targets, and they were seen as slightly nebulous. Things like make the NHS fit for the future. What does that mean? No one was really clear. Making sure people live in good health for longer, those kind of things. And then if you take the missions, then when they announced the missions, they said, okay, and then we'll come back with clearer policy pledges. And before you say, what are the first steps, those became first steps, and first steps were what they were going to do when they got into government. And then that today became the milestone. So essentially taking the missions, there were 5 missions, 5 missions became 6 milestones. Keeping up? 6 milestones. And the milestones are then kind of tangible targets that the next general election, they can say to people, okay, well, judge us on how we did.
And voters are supposed to understand all of this, are they?
Well, if they've listened to my explanation, I'm sure they will.
Absolutely. So what was the aim of this? What was Keir Starmer hoping to achieve today?
Well, I think it was, in terms of those tangible targets, to be able to kind of, if you think back to Tony Blair's pledge card, and some of these are going to be pretty easy to achieve, others much, much harder, but kind of being able to say to voters when we get to the next election, OK, well, look what we did. We achieved these things, tick, 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 they hope. But it was strange being that you mentioned I was at Pinewood Studios. It genuinely felt like a general election campaign event. And it felt like, there were members of the cabinet there for kind of questions afterwards. There were supporters. He was introduced by, I think, 3 or 4 different people. There was a video. It was a kind of glitzy event, and it felt very much like they were in campaign mode, which, to be honest, I think they still are, partly because they really do have their eyes on the next general election. The new chief of staff, he's not so new now, but Morgan McSweeney, that's his focus, kind of thinking about the next general election. So I think that was part of it. And part of it was to kind of redefine those missions, because I think basically since they got in, or potentially before, they've kind of realised that those are a bit vague. They're not really sure how they're going to be able to define them. But I think we can actually listen to what those milestones are now.
1. Higher living standards in every region of the country. 2. Britain rebuilt with 1.5 million new homes. 3. Safer streets. 4. The best start in life for every child. 5. Clean power by 2030. And 6. Waiting lists cut.
Well, that'll get them dancing on the streets of Okhta this evening, won't it? But no mention of defence, no mention of immigration.
No mention of defence, no mention of immigration. And, I put this to cabinet ministers afterwards. Why not? And they say, look, immigration was one of our foundations, border security, one of our foundations. This is something we're taking seriously. But I think the strange thing with having these tangible targets is it feels like everything else is slightly deprioritised, I suppose. But they haven't had the kind of smoothest first 5 months. And I should mention defence as well, because, they have said they're going to get to 2.5%. They haven't given it a timeline. And I think that is something that really worries people, especially in, of course, the current climate. But I mean, we've talked about it a bit, but the fact that we've had these slightly confusing various different targets as the years have gone on, that was something our LBC colleague Natasha Clark put to Sir Keir and said, what is this government actually trying to achieve?
People can measure, are we making proper progress on our missions, back to what we said 2 years ago, and what will it feel like for me? Will I have more money in my pocket? Will I be able to get an appointment at the NHS when I need it? So these are, if you like, something for the public to use to hold us to account on what we say we can achieve on the missions in the first 5 years. And I'll be absolutely straight about, it is also designed to push and drive the reform that we're going to need if we're going to ensure that we bring about the change that's so desperately needed.
It's funny, I thought that was what manifestos were for.
Well, I think that's exactly right. I mean, it is quite confusing. I put this to a cabinet minister afterwards and said, well, this felt like something you probably should have done during the campaign. And they kind of replied, well, we didn't know when the election was going to be, which I suppose everyone did think the election was going to be a bit later. But you have had 5 months of governing. And I think a lot of people will have been watching that speech and thinking, well, come on, just get on with it. Get on with governing. But I thought it was interesting, too, that there were some swipes at the civil service during that speech.
Now, that was the one interesting bit, wasn't it? I've got it here somewhere, or have you got the quote yourself? Because he basically said that it reminded me of that Tony Blair comment where he said he'd borne the scars of public service reform on his back, where the civil service just sort of was, I wouldn't say opposed to anything.
He said too many in Whitehall were comfortable in the tepid bath of managed decline, and said, he would make no apologies for trying to fix this, said, make no mistake, this plan will land on desks across Whitehall with a heavy thud of the gauntlet being laid down. But I think, we've talked a lot about the fact that... That's
some Dominic Cummings, isn't it?
Well, funny you say that. I mean, there's a really interesting piece tonight about the fact that lots of Labour officials have got into government and thought, oh my goodness, Dominic Cummings was right. But because they have found it really difficult. Yeah. The way the system is set up, they've got in and thought, this is so difficult to do anything, and kind of finding the bureaucracy really difficult. I mean, just on the planning, if we take that as one example, that's something that is one of these milestones, unlike defence, unlike immigration. And they have said, as part of that they are, what they need to do first is unblock the system. If they want to get to 1.5 million homes by the end of the Parliament, the first thing they're going to have to do for the next kind of couple of years is just unblock the system and try and kind of find a way around all of the bureaucracy and all of the kind of clogging that's happened so far.
Aggie, thank you very much indeed. That's Aggie Chambray, LBC's political correspondent. Andrew Fisher joins me now, former Labour Party Executive Director of Policy, now a columnist for the iPaper. Andrew, very good evening. Now, have Aggie and I been too cruel on Sir Keir Starmer?
Perhaps a tiny bit. Good evening, Ian, by the way.
Good evening.
I think, the problem for Keir Starmer is, look, his opinion poll ratings are bad. Labour's, slipping down in the polls. His own personal ratings have gone from plus 19 when he was first elected, when people wanted a change of government, to minus 32 now. And I think the problem is people were impatient for change. The Labour strategists kind of alighted on that pithy but rather nebulous slogan change, and people expected it. And at the moment, people only really noticed they've cut winter fuel allowance, which doesn't say much about boosting living standards and in every part of the country. You've taken £300 off 10 million pensioners. That's the issue that's really cut through. And until people do start to feel a bit better off, they're going to feel pretty negative to whoever's in government. And, I don't think setting some targets and saying, look, this is where we hope to get to in 2029 is going to make anybody think, well, that's good. I mean, people are struggling in the here and now, whether that's financially or whether it's people who are, perhaps okay off, but are struggling to find a GP, struggling to get an appointment on the NHS or waiting a long time, struggling to get a social care package for their loved one. Until those things start getting sorted out, I don't think whoever's in government is going to get much credit and much joy. And so sort of setting targets for things for 2029, I think is a bit by the by. It's those two things really, and all the opinion polls show us it. It's the NHS and it's the economy, living standards directly. And so until those two things are kind of addressed, I think all the rest of it is just a bit of noise and waffle, really. And we didn't get a lot of detailed plans. You talk about missions. Well, let's have the detail of it then. If you're going to talk about building 1.5 million homes by 2029, which hopefully is to bring down house prices so that the generation below me can afford to actually live, whether that's renting or buying, then you kind of need to have a skills strategy with that. Because have we got the construction workers in this country? Alongside, 150 big infrastructure projects?
You've been reading my iNewspaper column this week, haven't you?
I always read
exactly what I was saying.
iNewspaper columns are very good, often, as I'm sure you'll agree, especially ours. But, it's a great point. Look, the thing is, with all these things, it's complex. And I've got some sympathy for this kind of coming in and going, look, it's difficult to turn things around. There's been years of kind of stagnation, of managed decline. The NHS has been getting worse. People's living standards fell in the last parliament, the only parliament post-war, certainly, where that's been the case. It's going to be tough, and you can't expect him to have turned it around in 5 months. But you kind of want to see the detail of, like, this is how we're going to do it. Let's have a down payment, a bit like, to be given credit, I'll try and be, non-partisan. The SNP in their budget yesterday said, actually, we're going to restore the winter fuel allowance and we're going to cut scrap the 2-child limit on people, which will make people better off. They kind of went, here's some things tangibly we're going to do that will make you better off. And I think Labour need a bit more of that and a bit less of the grand vision stuff with pillars and missions and milestones and all the rest of the jargon.
What does it mean, do you think, that he's already watered down 2 of his key targets on net zero and also growth? Because they were adamant that Britain was going to have the highest level of economic growth of any G7 country. After 5 months, that doesn't seem to be the ambition any longer.
Well, I think they've tried to shift the emphasis, which I don't necessarily disagree with, because their new one, at least of what they've published today, says to me, and I'm going to read it because it's very long-winded, raising living standards in every part of the UK, which is the bit you clipped, as part of the government's aim to deliver the highest sustained growth in the G7. So it's sort of like we get the economy growing, but it's growing for the purpose of making you better off. And I think that's the point, because actually, if you look at what happened in the US, Joe Biden, and under his 4 years of presidency, had the highest growth in the G7. The US grew at faster than Canada, Italy, Germany, France, UK, and Japan. He did get the highest growth, but people didn't feel it because inflation eroded a lot of what should have come down to people. So I think that thing about your living standards are going to improve, you're going to feel better off, I'm going to guarantee that, is kind of making that rather nebulous thing. I mean, I doubt anyone. I mean, I've canvassed, you've canvassed during elections. I doubt you've opened the door and said people have kind of gone, well, I'm glad we've got the highest growth in the G7, or growth is at 2.3% rather than 1.8%. Nobody ever says that. What they worry about is the pound in their pocket and what they can buy with it. So I think a much bigger emphasis needs to be on boosting pay, boosting benefits, and capping costs. And that does mean having some difficult conversations about controls on energy bills, on water bills, and stopping them jacking up their massive bills already on us. Rent controls as well. Things like that are going to make people better off because they're not losing all their income just to live and to exist. I think those are the sort of things that Labour needs to be talking about. On clean energy, I mean, my understanding was the 100% or total clean energy, and now it's 95%. There's a bit of wiggle room there. That's probably just reality.
But again, it's not the sort of thing that people talk about down the dog and duck, is it?
No, it's not. It's very nebulous stuff. And to me, the two biggest things, and the opinion polls all bear this out as well, is get the NHS and social care sorted, get people's living standards up. They're the two things that Labour will be judged on.
And do something about immigration. I mean, that is a genuine thing that people do say on the doorstep, but that didn't feature today, really.
But I think we need an honest conversation in this country about immigration, because if you're going to say we're going to sort the NHS out, it takes 7 years to train a doctor. That's outside of the term of this government. So we are going to have migration. We are going to have that to fill some of the skills gaps we've got. There's no doubt about that. And to be honest, we need to take university numbers out of that as well. Unless we're going to start publicly funding universities to a much bigger extent again, like we used to. There was a shift where we took the funding away from universities. We said people are going to pay fees, and universities, you've got to attract more foreign students. We then put that into the immigration figures, and people say, oh, immigration's too high. Well, actually, 300,000 or 400,000 of that is students, which is actually a great export of our universities. It's a tribute to how good our university sector is that it attracts people. Now, again, it's having that rational conversation with people and saying, look, migration is high at the moment. It is historically high. There's no doubt about that. But if we don't have it at this level, you're talking about universities going bust, longer NHS waiting lists, even longer waits to get a social care package. Let's start talking about that, because it will take time, even if they put in all the investment in the world into training more doctors, training more nurses. And remember, doctor training places have been capped for years. That's still going to take a long time until we're not going to have to rely on migration for some of these areas. And, likewise, if universities start going bust because they're not getting the state funding and the numbers of foreign students coming over is falling, then that's going to hinder our ability to train engineers and all the other jobs we need to create growth as well. So we've got to have a serious conversation about this and not just pander to this numbers game or people's xenophobia, which some politicians have been whipping up over recent years.
Andrew, thank you very much. That's Andrew Fisher, former Labour Party Executive Director, now writes a column for the iNewspaper.
This is LBC with Iain Dale. Call 0345 6060 973.
7:24. A little bit of breaking news here. A tsunami warning has been issued following a 7.0 magnitude earthquake off the coast of northern California. The US National Tsunami Center raised the alert just before 11 a.m. local time on Thursday, a couple of hours ago. The United States Geological Survey said the quake was reported 100 kilometers southwest of Ferndale at a depth of 10 kilometers. It was felt widely across northern California and as far south as San Francisco, where residents felt a rolling motion for several seconds. It was followed by smaller aftershocks. Well, we'll get some more on that a little bit later in the hour. So we're talking about Keir Starmer's big reset speech, which we mustn't call a reset speech, which he delivered at the Pinewood Studios earlier today. As Aggie Chambray told us earlier, it felt like a campaign event rather than a government event. And I'm wondering, really, I still don't understand exactly what the point of it was. When you sort of talk constantly about pillars, foundations, milestones, missions, first steps, what are we to make of that? Now, is it part of the reason why Keir Starmer's approval ratings are really at rock bottom? I mean, he is now as unpopular as Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak were, possibly not quite as unpopular as Liz Truss was, but he's on the way there. What do you put that down to, given he's only been in office for 5 months? 0345 6060 973. Peter's in Blackpool. Hello, Peter.
Yeah, hello.
What would you like to say?
Well, he's told a load of lies. For one, about the police, he's going to put 13,000 police on the street, on the beat and everything else. But the old flying squad, there's 2,500 flying squad. He's getting rid of them, and he hasn't told anyone. No, I heard this on, on the news. One of the news channels, and he's covering up a lot. I voted Labour, and I'm thinking, he's going to do a lot better than Conservative and everything else. But I'm the one who's coming forward, and no journalist or anything wants to tackle this, with the government,
Tackle what?
They've knocked off, all the old day pensioners, cost of living, everything. I was getting cost of living. He's knocked it all back. I've lost my carers. I've got stage 4 cancer, end of life. I've lost that, and they've even taken away, everything. And what Angela Rayner turned around and said in the House of Parliament, or the council tax, what everybody's got to be aware of, I'm paying, it was £1,600, but I got a subsidy. But Angela Rayner said, all that's going to go and everybody's going to be paying full.
She hasn't.
The full council tax.
She hasn't said that. They've actually.
Yes, she was actually in the Houses of Parliament when she actually turned around and said it, because I actually watched it.
They have committed themselves to keeping the 25% single person's allowance.
No, she's got rid of it. She actually stood up.
She hasn't got rid of it.
Stood up. She's turning around saying that she has, and everybody,
you've totally misunderstood her then, because that's not what she said. In fact, it's the opposite of what she said.
She turned around and said, everybody who's on, who's claiming council tax is not going to get the benefit. They have to pay full council tax. And I'm in awarded assisted property here, and I actually turned around and said to the actual assisted warded manager about it, and she said, yes, I've heard it as well. And she said, because everybody's keeping a close eye. And it's all wrong. It's not fair. This is why I can't wait to the assisted dying to come out, because I'm putting what Labour is doing.
You won't be able to do that, because you won't be allowed to under the legislation. I don't know whether that was a flippant comment, but if it was in pretty bad taste. Peter, thank you. Jeff says, good evening, Iain. Glad to hear you attacking our democratically elected PM. I'm sure you can count to 6. They are clearly laid out today and are measurable. Why are you and the right-wing press continuously knocking the British government, who've been in power for just 5 months? How about you, for a start, show your patriotism and wish our country well? Go on, try. You might find you like it. I mean, seriously. If I had said that during Brexit to Remainers, show your patriotism and wish your country, I'd have been laughed out of court. I'm sorry, you'll have to do better than that, Jeff. Look, this government is incredibly unpopular after 5 months. I'm trying to find out why you think that. We heard there from a caller who seems to have got completely the wrong end of the stick on virtually everything. But maybe that is because Keir Starmer is not very good at explaining things. And he's using language that normal people just don't use. How many of us talk about milestones, missions, foundations, pillars, etc.? He's got to find a way of explaining what he wants to do in a way that we can all understand. And I'm not being deliberately thick here. I listened to that and I just thought, well, it's going to go over most people's head. It went mostly over my head. And you might think, well, that's no surprise. But anyway, it's 7:30 on LBC. We'll take more of your calls in a moment. 0345 6060 973. Why has Keir Starmer, why have Labour become so unpopular after such a short time? It can't be just the winter fuel allowance issue. It can't just be not restoring the or getting rid of the two-child benefit system. It has to be deeper than that. There just seems to be a narrative here that people believe that Labour have not done what they said they would do at the election, that change is not happening. And yes, you can say they've only been in power for 5 months, but the budget was a really missed opportunity, wasn't it? And if they are so concerned about economic growth, as they should be, as we all should be, then why on earth would you put taxes up to the extent that you have? Because that will diminish economic growth, it will add to inflation, and it will take money out of people's pockets. It's lunatic. 0345 6060 973. Also in a moment, the NHS is busier than ever before in England at the start of winter because of surging numbers of flu cases. We'll get more on that as well.
Iain Dale on LBC.
7:34. Well, the NHS is busier than ever in England at the start of winter because of surging flu cases. Well, let's talk to Paul Gallagher, who is health correspondent for the newspaper. Paul, very good evening. Every year we keep being told that the NHS is in a worse state than the previous year. I think a lot of people might have thought that people would have seen this coming.
Yes, indeed. I mean, when we look at, we usually tend to look at Australia and see how bad their flu season has been to see whether or not we're going to get the same. And they had in their summer, our summer was the worst ever. So I think there was a lot of concern that this was definitely heading our way. We got the latest, or the first, I should say, of the weekly hospital performance reports from NHS England this week, sort of confirming that people's worst fears, that the number of people in hospital with flu is more than quadrupled compared with last year, and hospital bosses saying the service is busier than ever for this time of year, not just rising cases of flu. We've got COVID-19, norovirus and the respiratory virus RSV on the up as well. Barely a spare bed in the NHS at the minute. 96,500 hospital beds occupied every day last week. That's about 95% capacity. And unsurprisingly, the NHS came out today and urged everyone who's eligible for a free flu jab and also COVID and norovirus jabs, which are also, not norovirus, the RSV jab, which are also free, to go and get them as soon as possible to prevent things getting even worse.
Wandering around London over the last few days, you do see a lot more people wearing masks at the moment. And I wonder whether that indicates that there is a resurgence of COVID or whether it's just people taking precautions.
It's probably a bit of both. I mean, we know that there is a resurgence around this time. Winter is typically when we see high cases of those viruses, and of course they heap additional pressure on our sort of already broken NHS, in the words of the PM earlier today. There are a multitude of issues within the NHS. There's still a huge number of vacancies, around 100,000 vacancies within the NHS. Demand goes up every year. We see the number of 999 calls, 111 calls, the number of admissions to hospital, the number of GP appointments, everything is going up by a greater degree than we're putting resources into the NHS. So it's a constant battle. I mean, talking to doctors today, one doctor told me that he was making a comment about Keir Starmer's speech, one of his 6 pledges that he made earlier today about trying to reduce the enormous NHS England waiting list of 7.6 million over the course of the Parliament. And they told me he's got no hope at all of doing that unless he focuses on the here and now, things like emergency care, improving those ambulance response times and A&E performances. Because if you don't do that, everything in the NHS has a knock-on effect, and the chances of him reducing that NHS waiting list would be next to impossible.
Has the decline in the number of beds in hospitals in this country stopped? Because if you look at the graphs since the mid to late 1980s, it's quite stark how few beds there are now in the NHS. And if you compare them with other countries, I mean, it's not good. Now, I think it's entirely right. If people can be treated in the community, in their homes, absolutely fine. But hasn't it gone too far?
I think many people would agree that it has, but I mean, I don't think this is going to be a trend that will end anytime soon. I mean, we know from the last 6 months of announcements that we're going to see more of these, what they call virtual wards, of people being treated at home with the doctor via Zoom, because they don't want people to come into hospital unless they absolutely have to. But yes, the number of beds that we have per head of the population is far fewer than many comparable European countries. You can say the same about that includes the number of doctors, number of GPs per head compared to other European countries as well. So there's obviously a wider debate going on in terms of how the NHS is funded, of course, as well, because people, I think, do get frustrated that we continue to pump enormous sums of money into the NHS, but performance-wise, it's been a big struggle. Although I would say that for many people would say, well, look, we just simply don't have the staff. As I pointed out earlier, 100,000 vacancies in the NHS, you are going to have a serious number of performance problems as a result of that. And that figure has come down slightly over the last 12 months, but it's been that six-figure, it's been that way for years now, and many people were pointing that out for a long time.
It does seem a huge number, but I'm wondering whether, what does the NHS employ? 1.2 million people now.
That's right. Yeah.
I mean, so say 10% vacancy rates. Now, I wonder how that is different from big multinational companies.
It would be, yeah. I mean, I imagine. But those big multinational companies probably wouldn't be able to function quite as well with the 10% of people missing. It is a tricky one. I mean, how do you? For years, we've tried to get people fill these gaps by going overseas and hiring hundreds of thousands of staff from, let's be honest, poorer countries, because it's ministers, successive governments have decided that this is a far cheaper way to try and sort of plug the vacancy holes that we have in hospitals across the country. Belatedly, we are increasing the number of medical places by several thousand over the next few years. But of course, it takes a minimum of 5 to 7 years to train nurses and doctors. So we won't start to see the effects of that for some time just yet.
Well, Jamie in Drury says, I booked my flu jab in Wales as I'm asthmatic. It was cancelled today due to the lack of vaccine. I mean, that seems incredible.
Yeah, they did push it back a few weeks, the vaccine this year, because they thought that if people do tend to come and get their jabs earlier in the season, but they pushed it back on the thinking that if you get it slightly later, it'll protect you for slightly longer, because of course the peak flu season does normally come after Christmas. It does normally arrive in sort of January, February, but of course each flu season is different, the severity of the strain is different, and unfortunately it looks like we're going to have an earlier peak this year, and they might not have got as your caller has said, they might not have got the distribution quite right this year.
Paul, thank you. That's Paul Gallagher, health correspondent for the iPaper. 7:42. Let's go back to your calls on Keir Starmer. Why has he become so unpopular so quickly? And what do you make of this big speech today? Let's go to Dan in Newham. Hello, Dan.
Hi, Ian. Good to speak to you. So I don't think it's very complicated. I think it comes down to simply Starmer's not providing the goods to the people that who voted him in, and he's broken quite a lot of pledges since he became the leader of the Labour Party. And I think unless people see their living standards increase, he's just going to be more unpopular, and he'll lose the election, similar to what happened to Joe Biden.
Isn't it too early to judge, though?
Well, I mean, the first thing he did when he's coming, one of the first things he did was, he took the benefit from the pensioners. So they've seen a decrease in the living standards, and then they could have easily scrapped the two-child benefit cap, which would have helped thousands of kids out.
Well, you say easily, but it would have cost billions. I can't remember what the cost was, but it was in the billions.
Yeah, sure. And this is it kind of moves me on to my next point, which I think is important. That there is enough money in the economy. We know the super wealthy have seen their wealth increase so much. And yet it's the people at the bottom who are suffering. And I think the reason why all these governments, including France and the US and I think, governments around the world, is that they represent the interests of the super wealthy instead of ordinary working class people. And to make the poor people better off, they need to basically take on the super rich. And that's why they never do, and that's why we end up where we are. And it's government after government falls, and we all kind of end up worse off.
I mean, far be it from me to defend the super rich, but the reason people mainly become super rich is because they've created wealth, they've created companies, they've employed a lot of people, and people need incentives to keep investing in business, in industry, and there is a balance to strike. Now, I'm not saying that the balance is right at the moment, but if you penalise rich people too much, then be very careful what you wish for, because there is already evidence of millionaires and billionaires leaving this country. Now, you may think, well, so what? Well, I think that is a crying shame, because they're taking their money with them and they will invest it in other countries rather than here.
Well, I mean, what I would say to that is that the rich have been never as good as they have been, basically, as they are right now. And when you see this massive disparity, you see all these social problems. There's a great book called The Spirit Level, and it talks about how this big wealth disparity ends up in a whole load of social problems, including crime, depression, poverty, of course. And my other point I want to make, what I think is quite important, the reason why Starmer, if you see the people who's donated to the Labour Party, they're people who've got tax havens, around the world. He's never going to take those on. And, all these billionaires who've donated to him, that's why he won't be able to really tax the super rich and let that wealth trickle down to the rest of us. And I don't think that's why I don't think anything's going to happen.
OK, Dan, thank you very much indeed.
Iain Dale, text 84850. This is LBC.
7:48. Let's quickly return to the news that a strong 7.0 magnitude earthquake has struck off the coast of Northern California. Let's get the latest on this from Nick Harper, LBC's US correspondent. Nick, what do you know?
Yeah, good evening, Ian. We know that the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, has now been briefed on it, and we've already got Californian authorities on the case, heading out to coastal areas to monitor the situation. And on top of that, about 5.3 million people living in California have received those mobile alerts on their phones telling them to stay away from coastal areas, to move to higher ground, warning them that they are in danger, because that's the real fear. It's a case of what happens next. There are no reports of any significant damage, no reports of any injury as a result of this earthquake, but that potential, that threat of the tsunami hitting the coastline is something that's getting a lot of people worried. About 5.3 million people under that tsunami warning. And there is also the chance of other aftershocks. Aftershocks in the region of 5.5 magnitude could potentially happen in the coming hours. So there is that concern, not just to Northern California, but to the state above it, Oregon, the southern part of that, also receiving those warnings to stay away from the coastal areas and to make sure that they seek higher ground. We've also seen plenty of people posting videos online, including of supermarkets where there's fruit rolling off of shelves in bars, with bottles having fallen off the shelves and smashed on the floors, and people's swimming pools in their backyards where there are those wave-type ripples on top of the surface. But like I say, no reports of any injuries yet. It's really now a wait-and-see situation of what happens over the course of the next hour as those tsunami waves potentially hit the coastal areas of California and Oregon.
And I suppose the concern is that along a lot of that coastline, if I'm right, there aren't any tall cliffs. It's fairly flat land behind the coastline.
A great deal of that area is, yes. And this earthquake hitting about 50 miles southwest off the coast of Eureka. It's not a hugely populated town, city. It's about 25,000 people, but it is an area that is on a low-lying coastal area. And therefore there is that potential, without any big cliffs, to break the impact of any waves that might hit. There is that real concern that waves would simply wash over those low-lying areas, those towns and those cities that are along that coastal area.
Nick, thank you very much indeed. If we get more on that, we will bring it to you during the course of the evening. That's Nick Harper, LBC's US correspondent. Back to Keir Starmer. Jan is in Hammersmith. Hello, Jan.
Hi. Honestly, Ian, I don't know whether to do a 40 Towers, John Cleese bang my head, rage. When I hear people ringing in saying that somehow reform are the saviour of this country when they are stuffed full of millionaires, stuffed full. Same with the Tory party, they are stuffed full. Most Labour MPs are not millionaires, but to bring business in, we have to work with businesses that believe in Labour policies. And they are. They are agreeing to the new pay structures coming in.
Oh, are they? Well,
Yeah,
why are all the surveys showing that business confidence is at a record low?
Do you know something? They said that about the minimum wage. I tell you what's going on now. It doesn't matter who in Labour. If Jesus Christ himself had got in as leader of the Labour Party, the right-wing press would absolutely carry on nitpicking, nitpick. And gradually, people's brains are slowly turned and twisted.
Okay, Jan, answer me this. Do you regard it as nitpicking if I point out that adding £2,500 to the employment costs of an average worker is inevitably going to mean job losses and fewer wage rises?
Okay, Ian, what I'm looking forward to seeing, if there are job losses, investment is coming into this country. We're prepared to accept what has been a long time coming. People cannot build lives on fresh air. They need bread on their tables. They need a roof over their heads. They need a reason to live and a reason to move on. In 1930s Germany, Ian, because you're a super intelligent man, I don't need to tell you, the Nazis played on race, they played on the disabled, they played on the unemployed, they were called scroungers, they were called, and gradually they were murdered. Bit by bit by bit. And all I'm saying is, if people think bad people then can't be as bad today, they need to give their heads a wobble, learn their history, and understand that the best way to go is to be kind, is to ensure decent pay, is to ensure we get the medical care.
I don't disagree with you, but how kind is it to cut welfare benefits from poor pensioners?
Well, I'm going to tell you this, Ian, okay? Please let me say this. For 14 years, the Tories did
just answer that question.
No, I am, but I've got to put context to it, please. For 14 years, the Tories did not once promote that pensioners on a certain level could get extra help. Not once. In this country, most pensioners own all of the property. Look at the ONS facts. Most pensioners have savings that the young don't. There are 1.5 million pensioners in poverty. Absolutely. Listen, I'm an old lady, okay? I'm not rich. I don't want to live fearful of my heating bill any more than anyone else. But I do know that children, 4.5 million children, have no hope, no chances. There are thousands living in bed and breakfasts. Their parents do work. We've got the working poor that are homeless. We've got domestic violence.
I'm not denying.
And may I say this, just one last thing.
Go on.
By rights, the election could have been held December. So by now, the party that would have won would be in, which would be Labour. But Sunak pulled the rug under his own party because he knew how bad and disgusting all it really was. And now Labour are having to pull out all of the broken parts of this country and say, and who do they blame? They blame a party that's been in for barely 4 months, 5 months. They don't look back
But do you
to
not
14
think,
years
do you
of
not think,
Tory destruction.
Do you not think that they could have made different choices, that instead of penalising 9 million pensioners, they could have put a couple of pence on fuel duty, for example, to raise the same money?
Ian, most pensioners are not poverty poor. Look at the figures. I have gone through the figures 1 billion times, so I know what I'm talking about.
There are many
correct.
pensioners who are very rich. Pensioners, you're completely correct, are the richest part of the entire demographic.
Thank you.
However, if you're going to say that you need to raise £1.4 billion, which is what the cut in the winter fuel allowance has done, there are plenty of other ways you could have done it.
But on on the other side of that, Ian, that money will now go to the pensioners on the breadline who haven't been advised by the Tory government. Did you know you are entitled to pension credits? That is going to make a massive difference to a lot of pensioners. Yes, I agree. Some are only a couple of pounds over. They do need help. I'm not saying they don't. But we need to be honest here. And what the hell and where the hell do people expect this party to start? Watch what will happen in America. If you want Trumpoism in this country, good luck, young people, because all I can say is you're on a downhill to absolutely nothing but hatred, racism, job losses. And by the way, Nigel Farage wants to privatise the NHS. He's on video. He wants people to have freedom to carry guns. He's on video. And also, he has said that people unemployed would get 4 months benefit, and if they don't find work, there's the door, bye-bye. Well, his constituency has one of the highest unemployment rates in the UK. So what is he going to do? Richard Tice was meant to bring investment into the areas where they won seats. Have they bothered? Have they put anything forward?
If you say it's too early to judge Keir Starmer, I would say it's too early to judge Richard Tice and Nigel Farage after 5 months.
And all Richard Tice and Farage have to do is just be racist. And then they'll stir up the honeypot or the wasp nest.
Well, they would completely deny that, of course.
Of course they would, but they're on record. You know, Nigel Farage.
Well, you say Nigel Farage is on record as wanting to privatise the NHS. I've distinctly heard him say in this studio that he believes in an NHS free at the point of use.
I will get someone. Unfortunately, as an old lady, I'm not on Twitter. I will find somebody.
Consider yourself blessed.
I'm barely on Facebook, to be quite honest.
Listen, we've got to the end of the hour, John, but can I congratulate you on a magnificent rant that didn't mention the words "and another thing" at all?
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate the time you've given me.
Well,
I really do.
Do call it, because there are lots of other people who wanted to get on, but I was enjoying it. Jan, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much.
Hear from you again soon. Magnificent. Right.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Iain Dale.
Jan, if you're still listening, and I hope you are, you've got a lot of fans on my text screen here. What a brilliant call by Jan, says Michael. Last lady caller was fantastic, says Stephen in Selby. The last call to your show by that lovely lady was one of the best, most passionate contributions to your show I have ever heard, says Stephen. So do phone in again, Jan. You've got a plethora of fans there. Now, we're going to move on. Thursday evening at 8, you know what we like to do then. We like to get into one particular subject with some experts and then take your calls to them. Today we're going to be talking about Ukraine, partly because today marks the 30th anniversary of the Budapest Memorandum, in which Britain, along with other countries, promised to defend Ukraine in return to Kyiv giving up its nuclear weapons. Well, that went well, didn't it? Now, I've got two guests with me, one with me and one remotely. Stephen Pfeiffer is former US ambassador to Ukraine, who was also part of the American negotiating team for the Budapest Memorandum. Stephen, welcome to the programme. Thank you for joining us.
Happy to be here. Good evening there.
Good evening. And Lee Turner is former British ambassador to Ukraine, who's the author of the new book, Lessons in Diplomacy, Politics, Power and Parties. Lee, welcome to you as well.
Good evening, Ian.
Now, Stephen, if I can start with you. What was the basic premise of the Budapest Memorandum? Who instigated the negotiations? And just tell us about what it was like being part of that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Ukraine had on its territory the world's third largest nuclear arsenal. Now, Ukraine in 1990, in its declaration of state sovereignty, had said it would be a non-nuclear weapon state, but the Ukrainians had several questions. One was who would pay for the elimination of the missiles and the bombers and the missile silos in Ukraine? And the U.S. government basically said, we will use cooperative threat reduction funding. We will bear those costs. The second question was that the nuclear warheads that were going to be returned by Ukraine to Russia for elimination had economic value in that they contained highly enriched uranium that could be blended down into low enriched uranium. And the Russians agreed to provide the Ukrainians an equivalent amount of fuel rods with low enriched uranium that matched the highly enriched uranium that they received in the weapons that were eliminated. But the third question was the one of security guarantees or assurances. And Ukraine was looking for some kind of assurance from the United States, Britain, and Russia that after giving up weapons, it would be secure. This was a fairly long discussion, and it went back and forth quite a bit. I mean, the US government, for example, we said we are not prepared to do security guarantees because to American ears, a guarantee implies something like what a NATO member has. Instead, we settled on the idea of security assurances, and then that led to the language which was actually agreed in January of 1994. And if you go to the trilateral statement that was signed by the American, Russian, and Ukrainian presidents, and this was done in consultation with Britain, the statement said once Ukraine accedes to the Non-Proliferation Treaty as a non-nuclear weapon state, it will receive these assurances. And that was ultimately then what was done on December 5, 1994 in Budapest.
So, 30 years ago, it seems to a lot of people that these assurances weren't worth the paper they were written on.
Well, the assurances, Russia has grossly violated them, beginning back in 2014 with the seizure of Crimea. But, when we talked to the Ukrainians asked us back in 1993, what will you Americans do if the Russians violate their commitments? And we said, we will take initiatives, we will do things. We said, we're telling you now, though, we're not going to guarantee that the American military is coming to your aid, but we will do things. We did not have a detailed conversation as to what exactly the steps that would be taken because there was a failure. That failure was in Washington, but that failure was also in Kyiv. We didn't foresee what the Russians did in 2014 or 2022. I think had the Ukrainians really felt that that was a real possibility, they might have tried to hold on to the nuclear weapons, and we might not have had a solution. But I look back now and say, look, in the last 2 years, the United States has provided Ukraine over $100 billion in military and financial assistance. That, to my mind, is consistent with what we told the Ukrainians we would be doing 30 years ago.
Lee Turner, during your period as ambassador, I think it's 2008 to 2012, was there any sense that the Budapest Memorandum was in question at all, that people thought that, well, if something did happen, that the US and Britain would take some action?
Well, by the time that I became ambassador in Kiev in 2008, we'd already had Vladimir Putin as president of Russia for a number of years. And it's important to distinguish between the atmosphere in which the Budapest Memorandum was signed back in 1994, when you had a President Yeltsin in Moscow, you had the Ukrainians really having a good relationship with Russia. And everybody was working together. You remember back then, Russia was not using its Security Council veto to stop international action, for example, in the first Gulf War. And we thought that we had a chance that Russia would become a cooperative partner, a normal country, if you like. And all that began to change when Putin became president of Russia around the year 2000. And from then on, we began to see an increasingly uncooperative, difficult, challenging Russia. For example, the poisoning of Yuri Litvinenko in London at the beginning of the new millennium, quite a shock to everybody. And by the time 2008 came round, we had a President Yushchenko, who was the president of Ukraine, who was extremely suspicious of Russia. He was very concerned that Russia might take military or economic action against Ukraine. And Steve's quite right that back at the beginning of the 90s, even with Yeltsin in power in Moscow, many Ukrainians were very concerned that they were giving up these nuclear weapons for nothing. It was argued that the nuclear weapons were useless to Ukraine because they were under Soviet control in the first place. They weren't under Ukrainian control, and it cost a lot of money to look after them. The Ukrainians weren't necessarily capable of looking after those nuclear weapons.
And what's the truth of that?
Well, it's pretty true, actually. But
there are some people who say, well, of course, if Ukraine had retained its nuclear weapons, this invasion would never have happened. So you would say that that's irrelevant.
There's elements of truth in that. I mean, on the one hand, they weren't Ukrainian nuclear weapons. On the other hand, I do think that if Ukraine had had nuclear weapons on its soil, we wouldn't have had Vladimir Putin saber-rattling and threatening to use his nuclear weapons every 10 minutes, which we've seen ever since 2014.
Stephen, do you agree with that?
Yeah, a little bit. Actually, one of the things that we learned back in 1993 was the Ukrainians had physical custody of nuclear weapons. So, for example, weapons in storage were entirely being guarded, maintained by the Ukrainians. The problem was most of the infrastructure for maintaining Soviet nuclear weapons was in Russia. So there wasn't much the Ukrainians could do. I was told several years after I retired from government in 2004 by a former Ukrainian official that sometime in 1992, the Ukrainians convened a meeting of senior military and foreign policy people and said, look, our policy is that Ukraine will be a non-nuclear weapon state. If we were to change that policy, could we maintain an independent nuclear deterrent? And part of the problem the Ukrainians faced was Soviet nuclear warheads had relatively short shelf lives. So a lot of the warheads that they had were going to be past their expiration date within a couple of years. And what I'm told the Ukrainians concluded in that discussion was they did not have the infrastructure to maintain an independent nuclear capability. And building that infrastructure would have cost a huge amount of money that Ukraine simply did not have.
Lee?
No, I think that's absolutely right. And there is a problem, however, for any country now which is bordering Russia or which could ever be threatened by Russia, which does not have nuclear weapons. And they are faced with a Russia which threatens to use nuclear weapons if anybody resists them invading a neighbor. This is what Russia has consistently done since 2014. They have said, if other countries help Ukraine, we might use our nuclear weapons. If you give jet aircraft to Ukraine, we might use our nuclear weapons. If you give tanks to Ukraine, if you allow Ukraine to use long-range missiles, we might use our nuclear weapons. And what has happened, if we look back at the 1990s, why were we so worried about these nuclear weapons lying around in Ukraine? We were worried about nuclear proliferation. That is, that those weapons could be used by somebody else, they could be stolen, they could be bought, they could just be filched. And we were trying to stop the spread of nuclear weapons worldwide under this non-proliferation treaty, which Ukraine agreed to join when it signed before it signed the Budapest Memorandum. The memorandum was putting that into legal form. And what Putin has done now is to drive a coach and horses through nuclear non-proliferation measures worldwide, because anybody who borders Russia or might ever be in a conflict with Russia is now thinking, how the hell do we defend ourselves against a country which threatens to use nuclear weapons at the drop of a hat?
I mean, let's start looking to the future, because the war has been going on now for nearly 3 years. It'll be 3 years on February the 22nd next year. It seems to me that the next 12 months are going to be the key 12 months to what happens or how it ultimately ends. And I think there's probably a difference of public opinion in Britain and America as to what each country should do now in terms of responding to what's happening in Ukraine. Stephen, just outline the public debate in the United States on this at the moment. Does it all revolve around Donald Trump coming to the presidency again?
Well, I would note that I think polls show that there still remains fairly strong support, although it was less than a couple of years ago, among the American public for Ukraine and for U.S. support for Ukraine. If you go back to the vote that was held last spring in the Congress, there was overwhelming support among the Senate and also very strong support, including half the Republicans, for providing assistance to Ukraine. But the big question mark is Donald Trump. He is unpredictable. I have to say quite candidly, I am nervous about his presidency and what it means for Ukraine and for European security and for American interests there. First of all, he has this inexplicable affinity for Vladimir Putin, which no one's been able really to figure out. But second, at no point in the last 2 years has he expressed support for the idea of the U.S. providing assistance to Ukraine. Now, perhaps he changes when he's in the White House. I very much hope he will. But I'm nervous about this. And I look at there's a number of ideas now floating around, including from people close to Mr. Trump, that talk about settlement options. But typically, they involve Ukraine acceding, at least temporarily, some land to Russia, and also Ukraine accepting neutrality. And I'm not sure what's in those proposals that would be of interest to Kyiv.
I think it's very interesting that Donald Trump has met with Zelensky. He's talked to him on the phone since the election. But you're right. He is unpredictable. We don't know what was in those conversations. But Zelensky has now started talking about a possible settlement at some point, and we'll come on to that in just a moment. So we'll take calls to our two colleagues here in the studio and virtually. Where are you in America, Stephen? We want to know.
I'm in California, just south of the San Francisco Bay Area.
Oh, so you're not in tsunami range then, I hope?
I'm about 20 miles inland, and the earthquake is about 250 miles north of me, so I'm not particularly worried about that particular threat.
Thank goodness for that. Now, so the question I'm going to ask our listeners is this. What should Britain's attitude towards this war be in 2025 once Trump is back in power, and with Zelensky now hinting at accepting a ceasefire and possibly losing the Crimea and Donbass if the rest of Ukraine joins NATO? When you hear about what Britain promised to Ukraine 30 years ago, do you feel that we have let them down? And if so, have we made up for it with how we've supported them in this war? 0345 6060 973.
Iain Dale. Call 0345 6060 973. Text 84850. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
18 minutes past 8 on LBC. 0345 6060 973. If you'd like to put a question to either of our guests here or comment on anything that they have said. We have Stephen Pfeiffer, who is a former US ambassador to Ukraine, and Lee Turner, former British ambassador to Ukraine, 2008 to 2012. Lee, what's it like being an ambassador to a country like Ukraine?
Well, being an ambassador to any country is, of course, a massive privilege. You know you're standing on the shoulders of giants, the ambassadors who've been before you, who've really been amazing people in many cases, and you're representing your country. And that is seriously an honour and an enormous responsibility. So if you're a British ambassador, before you go on your posting on to a bilateral to another country, you get 15 minutes with the head of state. It was the Queen when I was doing it. Now it's the King, of course. And if you're in any doubt about the magnitude of your task, that will dispel it.
And what other countries have you been ambassador to?
So I was lucky enough to be ambassador in Kiev in Ukraine from 2008 to 2012. Then I was consul general, which was like a similar level, but subsidiary to the ambassador in Ankara in Istanbul for 4 years. And then for 5 years I was ambassador in Austria during the Brexit years, which was quite challenging for many ambassadors, of course. And I was also the UK permanent representative to the international organisations in Vienna.
And you were in Ukraine for 4 years. I mean, was there part of you that when all the Maidan revolution was happening, were you thinking, oh, I wish I'd had that 4 years rather than the previous 4 years? Because that would have been quite an exciting time, I imagine.
Well, people often say that diplomats love a good crisis. and you know that when the stuff hits the fan, you know that everything else fades into insignificance and you're going to have to concentrate on something that really, really matters. But all the time that I was in Ukraine, I was intensely conscious that the future of Ukraine would be fundamental to Europe and the world, because it's a big country. It's bigger than France, sitting right in the middle of Europe between Russia and Eastern Europe. And whether Ukraine can become independent, sovereign and prosperous, or whether it is reabsorbed by an imperial Russia, will have enormous implications for all of us. And there was never any doubt about that. And as soon as President Putin launched his war against Georgia in 2008, everybody in Ukraine realized that they could be next. So we were doing our best during the time I was ambassador to help build up Ukraine's economy, particularly in Crimea, because we could see that was an obvious flashpoint. But obviously we didn't do enough.
And Stephen, what are your memories of being US ambassador to Ukraine? When were you there?
I served there from the beginning of 1998 until the end of 2000, so 3 years at a very different time. At that point, for the first 2 years, Yeltsin was still the Russian president. And while Yeltsin had many flaws, he still fundamentally accepted that Ukraine was a sovereign and independent state within the borders that were Ukraine's borders in 1991. So whenever there were in the Russian parliament, there were suggestions that maybe we should take back Crimea. Yeltsin usually came out and said the right thing. No, Crimea is Ukrainian. When my last year there, Putin had become president of Russia, and Ukrainians were a bit nervous. I don't think that they saw him as the threat that he turned out to be in 2014 and 2022 at that point, but they just saw him as bringing a very different approach to Russian-Ukrainian relations than Yeltsin had taken. And it turned out that their nervousness was well justified.
It's worth adding, actually, if I may, that we don't only have the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, which was it was a memorandum. It wasn't an international treaty. And the US, the UK, did not promise to defend Ukraine. They promised not to violate the sovereignty of Ukraine. Russia also promised that. The UK, the US, and Russia promised never to use economic sanctions against Ukraine. Russia also promised that. They broke that. So there were a series of broken promises there. But that's only half the story. In 1997, Russia and Ukraine signed a treaty on friendship, cooperation and partnership, also known as the Big Treaty or the Большой Договор. And that was Russia officially recognizing Ukraine within its 1991 boundaries, including Crimea. So that was an official international treaty, which Putin then trashed when he invaded Ukraine in 2014. So really, if you're talking about keeping promises, this is what we should be looking at. Complete trashing of international treaties between Ukraine and Russia, where Russia not only promised never to attack Ukraine, but later on they recognized Ukraine within its 1991 boundaries.
Well, let's return to... Sorry, Steve. Yep, go on.
One other commitment, the last commitment in the Budapest Memorandum, was that if there were any questions about compliance with the commitments, any one of the parties could call a meeting of the four: the United States, United Kingdom, Russia, and Ukraine. And so in April of 2014, after the seizure of Crimea, the Ukrainians invoked that provision and called for a meeting of the four. The American and British foreign secretaries showed up. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov of Russia did not come. And when he was asked, he said, well, we're not obligated by the Budapest Memorandum because we didn't sign it with this particular government, the government that had emerged after the Maidan Revolution. That, as Mr. Lavrov knew at the time, is totally ludicrous. If you go by that philosophy, anytime a government changes, when we go from President Biden to President Trump, every country would have to re-sign every international agreement we have with them. The Russians were not even prepared to meet after their violation.
Why was Britain included in these negotiations for the Budapest Memorandum? And France wasn't.
Yeah, I don't know, Steve. Do you know the answer to that?
Because the security assurances, they were linked to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and the United States, Britain, and Russia are depository states for countries that want to accede to the NP treaty, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So the United States, before a formal trilateral negotiation began between the United States, Russia, and Ukraine, the Americans were talking informally to both the Russians and the Ukrainians about security assurances that they might be prepared to provide. And then there was a conversation then going on between the Americans and the British on the same count. And I would note that after the Budapest Memorandum was signed by Prime Minister Major, Presidents Clinton, Kuchma, and Yeltsin, both the French government and the Chinese government unilaterally issued basically the same assurances for Ukraine. But they were done apart from what was actually signed at Budapest, but I think the language was virtually identical.
Well, I feel educated about the Budapest Memorandum, which is what this hour is all about. Well, not educating me, but educating our listeners. So thank you for that, Stephen. Let's take a couple of questions here. Al says, does the panel think that Western values have been abandoned if we make security assurances in the Budapest Memorandum, but then do not help Ukraine to win? Well, I guess, Lee, you would say, well, there weren't security guarantees in that.
They weren't security
assurances, says Al. Sorry.
That's right. They weren't, as I said, they weren't security guarantees in the sense that we promised we would come to their aid to defend them with our own troops. And of course, there would have been a huge debate if we'd promised to do anything like that. But at the same time, it was the UK, the US that were encouraging Ukraine to give up its nuclear weapons. We wanted them to give up their nuclear weapons, to get those weapons destroyed in Russia, basically. That was what we were hoping to see. And we promised to give them financial support in return for them doing that. So we do have a certain moral obligation. And I think it's absolutely vital, not only because of that moral obligation, but also for our own security interests, that we don't let Russia win this war. Because if Russia ends up incorporating 1 square inch of Ukraine into Russia as a result of this completely unprovoked attack on Ukraine in 2014 and again in 2022, then every country around the world is going to think, why don't I invade my neighbor if the international community is going to do nothing? We've already seen it with Venezuela threatening to occupy 2/3 of Guyana, which it suddenly has discovered it has a claim to. And every other country will be doing that. And plus, we would be facing a much more aggressive Russia that feels it won this war and will be getting ready to attack again in a few years. So our security situation would be much worse if Russia wins this war, which is why we should be helping Ukraine, not only because we have a moral duty to do so, but because it's in our security interests, we as the UK, and US security interests as well.
Stephen?
Yeah, I would second that. I mean, again, I've had arguments with colleagues in the think tank world who say, look, the United States, we didn't invade Ukraine. We respect their sovereignty, their territorial integrity. We have lived up to the Budapest Memorandum. But I say, you actually have to go beyond that and look at the negotiating record. And that's where when Ukrainians said, well, what will you Americans do if the Russians violate it? And that's when we said, we will do things. Again, we didn't have a detailed discussion of what we would do because we didn't foresee what happened in 2014 or 2022. I believe now, although I think the United States should be doing more, that the kinds of assistance we provided in the last 2 years is consistent with what we told the Ukrainians while negotiating the language. But I also very much second Lee's second point. Quite apart from whatever obligation that the United States has to Ukraine going back to 30 years ago, when the Ukrainians eliminated those nuclear weapons, the United States for 7 decades has defined a stable and secure Europe as a vital national American security interest. I don't think you get now a stable and secure Europe if you have an unstable and insecure Ukraine. And if Vladimir Putin should win in Ukraine, I'm not sure his ambitions stop with just Ukraine. I think an empowered and emboldened Mr. Putin, if he wins in Ukraine, is going to pose potentially a much greater threat to Europe and to transatlantic security.
Well, in a moment, let's talk about what victory, I mean, Lee, you alluded to this here, what victory might look like, but also what victory would look like for Putin, because you could argue that the most likely outcome of this is that there'll be some messy compromise where there is an agreement drawn up where Russia keeps Crimea and the Donbass. Now, in theory, I would argue that would be totally unacceptable to Zelensky. But in the end, and I've said this consistently through, Britain, America, whoever, cannot dictate what the Ukrainian people should or should not accept. That has got to be down to them and to President Zelensky. But if he says, well, no, I'm not going to accept any of that, I'm not sure quite where this goes in 2025. So let's explore that in the next few minutes, and we'll be taking your calls as well. 0345 6060 973. We've got 2 Ukrainian experts here, 2 former ambassadors. If you want to ask them a question or just put forward your point of view, we'd love to hear from you.
Leading Britain's conversation. Iain Dale. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
8:33 on LBC. We have Lee Turner with us, former British ambassador to Ukraine. He's got a new book out, Lessons in Diplomacy, Politics, Power and Parties. 30-second elevator pitch, Lee.
What diplomats and ambassadors really do behind the scenes. You've always wanted to know what's going on behind those walls, and how can you make it fun? That's what the book's about.
How big are the Ferrero Rocher orders? That's what we all want to know.
Absolutely right. If you want to irritate an ambassador, just mention the words Ferrero Rocher.
That's why I did it. That's why I did it. I'm sure that's completely... Stephen, I'm sure you don't even know what we're talking about with Ferrero Rocher, or do you? Because there's an television advert for this brand of chocolates. It's all about a diplomatic reception, and so we all think now that they're supplied at all British embassies. Right, let's... so Stephen Pfeiffer is with us as well, former US ambassador to Ukraine. Shahid's in Hemel Hempstead. Shahid, what would you like to say?
Be interested in your guest's response, but I thought at the time, I was only 14, 15 at the time of the Soviet Union collapsing. I couldn't believe how quickly the UK and the US started to lower their guards. I believe the generals in the British Army when they said we're lowering our guard far too soon, they're cutting back on military, like spending far too much. We're not going to be able to defend ourselves if another war comes along. I believed them. It was obvious. And then when it came to Ukraine, I found America especially to be far too fanatical about nuclear weapons, and they weren't understanding or considerate in why certain countries like Ukraine, like Pakistan, needed nukes. Pakistan needed them because of a threat from India. India wanted them originally in 1974 because of a threat from China. And with Ukraine, I always foresaw, I was about 18 at the time, I always foresaw that if it came to it, if Russia ever went back to type, there's no way that Britain and America would want to get involved unless they really had to. And then finally, Blair, I couldn't believe how Blair totally embraced Putin when Putin emerged on the scene as the prime minister. And all the experts, all the Russian experts, the media ones, they were saying Putin is ex-KGB. He thought that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the biggest disaster ever, and he thought it was a mistake. And I was thinking, why on earth is Blair embracing him when it's so obvious that he's just going to bide his time, and once he's regrouped, he's going to try and get the Soviet Union back, and that's what's been going on ever since.
Don't you think it was partly to do with the response to 9/11, where President Bush also embraced Putin because Putin was very supportive in the aftermath of 9/11?
And I think W. Bush, he followed Blair's cue, but he also went into a false sense of security. I think when it comes to Russia, especially Putin's very good at bluffing. But we've seen, like Trump's been saying, there's no wars under him. But Ukraine was invaded in 2014. And even without full-on support from Trump then, Putin couldn't get past eastern Ukraine. So I'm hoping Zelensky, he fights it out with or without the American support. I hope the rest of the developed world backs it up, including Japan and the oil-rich countries. I hope we all do our bit. And if Trump wants to go into isolation mode, let him. But I think they've all been too scared, too easily put off by Putin, and the West would easily defeat Putin. And I personally just wish they'd take him out. Take Kim Jong-un out, and just take all the bad guys out.
OK, well, I hear there's a new series of 24 starting, so maybe we can send Kiefer Sutherland to achieve that. Stephen, it's an interesting thing, this about Putin and whether the West played him right at the beginning. Did Bush and Blair embrace Putin too quickly, do you think?
Well, I'd make two observations. The fact that Putin responded in the way that he did on 9/11 scored him a lot of points with President Bush. So 10 days after 9/11, the Russians basically gave a green light for the U.S. to deploy military forces to Central Asia. These were things, for example, search and rescue teams that had to be near Afghanistan before the air campaign began. The other point is, I think in his early years, Putin was actually trying to forge some kind of relationship with the West. The problem was it was on his terms. He was not prepared to change certain policies that at the end of the day, simply there were just these big differences. After about 2003, 2004, you begin to see drift in U.S.-Russian relations. And I'm not going to say it's all Russia's fault. I think Washington bears some of the responsibility for the decline in the relationship after, say, 2003, 2004. But I will put the bulk of it on the Russians. And again, it was on large part Putin's failure to accept the collapse of the Soviet Union, his desire to reassert a sphere of influence or even physical control in the post-Soviet space, and even extend that sphere to include Eastern Europe. And that's been a fundamental problem between the United States and Russia now.
And Lee, there's also a school of thought that says the West collectively let down Russia in the 1990s, that we didn't provide the support that Yeltsin was constantly asking for.
This is part of the Russian narrative, the Putin narrative, really, that whatever happens, it's all somebody else's fault. It's never Putin's fault. It's never Russia's fault. I was in Russia 92 to 95 in the embassy there as First Secretary Economic, and we were bending over backwards to help the Russian economy. We had a thing called the Know-How Fund. We were pouring in money.
I remember that.
The Germans in particular were investing billions of Deutschmarks, paying Russia to withdraw its troops from eastern Germany. Everybody wanted to develop the Russian economy to help the Russians. And this idea that somehow they were let down is a pure figment of Vladimir Putin's imagination. I mean, I think what's really happened is that Putin could have embraced the West. There was talk of maybe even having Russia in NATO shortly after the collapse of the Soviet Union. We were open to almost anything if Russia was prepared to engage. But what Putin found was that there were more votes, more popularity in having an external enemy and whipping up people's fears of an external enemy. You may remember the Falkland War, 1982. Why did that happen? It was the generals in Argentina who thought, we're not popular. People are getting upset about our useless economy. Let's have a foreign adventure. And Putin's a bit the same. You know, he wants to show that we are being beset by enemies. We're surrounded by enemies. Everybody's against us. You know, the Millwall football fans, you know, nobody likes us and we don't care. And I think that's a lot of it, really. And if, as we've said already, if Russia goes on down this course, I mean, Shahid has a bit of a point that our armed forces are fairly strong, but are they strong enough for a long war? They're certainly not.
Well, according to the Veterans Minister this week, I couldn't believe what I was reading, where he was saying, well, 6 months, that'd be about it.
Absolutely right. And you've seen already the enormous amounts of munitions that are being used up in this 3-year war between Russia and Ukraine. I mean, Shahid's also right to say, isn't it extraordinary that Russia can't beat Ukraine? They're actually having to go to North Korea and beg troops and ammunition from them. They're getting munitions from Iran. And when I say Putin says everything that happens is somebody else's fault, we have Russia bombarding every corner of Ukraine with Iranian drones, using ballistic missiles to attack every part of Ukraine, using their latest intercontinental ballistic missile, possibly a new kind of very large missile that has a 5,000-kilometer range to attack Ukraine. And then as soon as Ukraine fires a missile that has a range of 200 or 300 kilometers, they say, oh, this is completely unacceptable. I mean, it's absolutely an extraordinary narrative and we shouldn't swallow it.
No, we shouldn't. Matt in High Wycombe says, I've been puzzled for a long while now over the military support given to Ukraine by America and Europe. It seems that they're given just enough so they can't lose, but not enough to enable them to win. So inevitably, the meat grinder keeps grinding. Is it possible that the current status quo suits America and Europe as it stops Putin having any more expansionist goals, depletes his military and finances, and stops Russia from being a player on the world stage? Well, Stephen, never let it be said that we have cynical listeners, but I mean, you can see a certain logic to that, can't you?
Yeah, well, I guess I'll make 2 points. I think in some cases where the United States and the West provided weapons, there truly was an issue. For example, the United States military maintains certain levels of weapons for its own war. And we found that over the last 20 years, as we focused on places like Afghanistan and Iraq, we had let some of our capabilities atrophy. And so I think there were some limitations, for example, in artillery shells that the West could provide Ukraine simply because Western militaries had to maintain a certain minimum number in their stocks. But I think also there was a bit of reluctance, certainly in Washington, because of fear that I do not believe was well-grounded about Russia might do. So the Biden administration, going back really to February of 2022, has said they had 2 goals. One was to help Ukraine win. And I don't believe they want to just drag this war out and definitely drain Russia, but they wanted to help Ukraine win. But they also wanted to avoid a NATO-Russia military clash. And those are the right 2 goals. But where I've been critical of the Biden administration is that in balancing those goals, they have been way too cautious. And so the Russians have made vague threats, even sometimes nuclear hints. But when we've seen, for example, the West begin supplying Ukraine with new types of weapons, for example, HIMARS rockets or F-16s, the Russian reaction has really been fairly conservative. And it was interesting that Washington and London in November basically told Ukraine you can use American-provided ATACMS missiles and British-provided Storm Shadow missiles to hit targets inside Russia, as Lee said, a couple hundred kilometers inside Russia. And a couple days later, the Russians put out a new nuclear doctrine, which I think in some ways is not credible. But also Vladimir Putin, the day that they launched this new Oreshnik ballistic missile against Dnipro, says, this is a response. We're escalating. What was interesting is, according to the New York Times today, the chief of the Russian General Staff spoke to the chairman of the American Joint Chiefs, and General Gerasimov said, we had planned to use that Oreshnik, a long time ago. It was totally disconnected. So again, I think in the West, we have been more worried about Russian reaction, Russian escalation than, in fact, Russian policy over the last 2.5 years is justified.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And this comes back to the question of what will happen if we have a President Trump in the White House. What will be his policy on Ukraine? And he's talked about solving this in 24 hours. I think we have to treat that promise with caution. We've seen when Trump was president first time round, he promised
Spoken like a true diplomat, if I may say so.
He promised to sort out the problems of the Korean Peninsula and do a deal. And he tried to do a deal and absolutely nothing happened. Plus, we have to look at a new President Trump's agenda, which includes everything from Chinese imports to stopping immigration to sorting out the Middle East. He's got a lot to do. But it's not impossible that he would push Ukraine to accept a deal that might look to us very much like Russia winning. And
would that be keeping the Donbass and Crimea? Would Putin interpret that as a victory?
There's a lot of play around what a deal might look like. And a really bad deal for Ukraine would look like giving Russia some territory, which became part of Russia. A medium bad deal would be saying, OK, we're going to freeze the front line, and the part of Ukraine which Russia occupies is not recognized in international law as being part of Russia. We consider that to continue to be a part of Ukraine, but we're not going to give Ukraine any security guarantees. That would be extremely dangerous for Ukraine. Or we're not going to let Ukraine join NATO, which is what Ukraine would want to do. And that would also be extremely dangerous for Ukraine, because who else is going to give security guarantees, put boots on the ground in Ukraine if they don't get NATO membership? So there's a whole range of areas there. And indeed, as your listener Shahid said earlier, it's very interesting. If you look at the size of the Russian economy, it's around $2 trillion. Sounds like a lot. But the EU and the UK alone are more than 10 times that size, even when we leave out the United States. So in theory, if we wanted to, we could provide far, far more military aid to Ukraine. It's only a matter of political will and, of course, gearing up our military expenditure, which is a huge job. And, of course, when we've got a struggling NHS and other problems at home, people might say, should we really help Ukraine?
Well, believe me, they do whenever I cover this subject.
But if we don't help Ukraine by cranking up military expenditure, what we will be facing in 5 years' time will make this military expenditure we need now look like chicken feed.
I always smile when we talk about, we've got to commit 2.5% of GDP to defence. It's going to be more like 4 or 5% by 2030, and I don't think anybody is looking at that
We'll
at
dream
all.
of 4 or 5% in 2030 if Russia wins this war.
We'll come to a question from Mike in Bridgend at the moment. It goes back to your point about NATO, but we must take a break first.
Iain Dale on LBC.
8:51. Stephen Pifer, former US ambassador to Ukraine, is with us, and Lee Turner, former British ambassador to Ukraine, is here too. If either of you wondered why on earth you're giving up an hour to join me on LBC to talk about this, here is the validation that you need from Mervyn. who says, since Russia invaded Ukraine, I've been listening to a lot of discussions about this on the radio over the years, but I have to say this is the best so far. There needs to be more of this so the public can understand the background. Great explanations from your two guests. So thank you very much. Well, at least Mervyn appreciates you.
Right, thanks, Mervyn.
Thank you.
Right, let's go to Mike in Bridgend. Mike, what would you like to say?
I'll try not to jinx it, but my question is, do you think that Putin thinks that for some NATO countries, NATO-protected territories, that the guarantee of mutual protection is kind of just on paper only, like the Baltic states? Do you think that he calculates that if he was able to encroach on those physically and take over some of that territory, that countries like America wouldn't be willing to go toe-to-toe with Russia if he did something like that? In other words, of course, if they attacked somewhere like France or whatever, there'd be, no doubt he'd get a severe reaction. But do you think he thinks that for smaller NATO territories, he can basically snip off bits and NATO wouldn't fully protect those territories if push came to shove?
Okay. Lee?
Absolutely not. I think the benefit for the Baltic countries and other Russian neighbours of being in NATO is the Article 5 obligation, which obliges all member states of NATO to defend any NATO member that is attacked. And that applies as much to the Baltic states as it does to the United States itself. And it's very interesting, actually, if we look at Putin's complaints about NATO, it's until 2014, there wasn't really much discussion about NATO in Ukraine. They've been told no, you can't join NATO at the Bucharest summit in 2008. And after that, really not very much happened until 2014.
But I think Mike's point is, does Putin think that countries like, I don't know, Belgium, I mean, not picking on the Belgians, but Belgium, if they invaded Estonia, for example, would Belgium, would the Czech Republic, would those maybe smaller members of NATO get behind? Because I think Britain, France, America would regard it as a duty to react to that.
Yeah, no, I think all member states would regard it as a duty. What I was going to say was that what really has changed is that since 2014, and particularly since 2022, a number of countries, such as in particular Sweden and Finland, which had been neutral in some cases for centuries, in the case of Sweden, have suddenly realized just how great the danger from Russia is, and they have joined NATO. By the way, doubling the border between NATO and Russia in the course of that, because Finland has a long border with Russia. So it's absolutely fundamental that if any NATO state is attacked, whether it's Estonia or anybody else, they will be defended. And indeed, there are British active service troops in Estonia as we speak, defending it.
Di has a question. I'm assuming this isn't meant to be ironic, but he says, what about a non-aggression pact starting with Russia, the USA and the EU? Of course, Russia has a bit of a history with non-aggression pacts, doesn't it? But let's not even go there. Stephen, do you think that if Putin invaded Estonia, a Donald Trump-led government would come to Estonia's aid?
Well, here's my worry, which is that if a Trump administration does end assistance to Ukraine, what lesson does Vladimir Putin draw from that? So unless in 3 years, the United States, having lost not a single soldier in Ukraine, ends assistance to Ukraine, does Mr. Putin believe that the United States would go to war against Estonia? And
go to war to protect Estonia.
To protect Estonia.
Yeah, I think that might be a stretch.
Yeah. But here's the point is we've already seen that Vladimir Putin is capable of making enormous miscalculations. He thought the war that he launched, or the invasion that he launched in February of 2022, was going to be over in a matter of a couple of months, if not weeks. I mean, the Ukrainians, for example, said that in one of the convoys that they shot up in the early days north of Ukraine, they went and looked at one of the trucks. It wasn't full of ammunition or fuel or food for the soldiers. It was full of dress uniforms for the victory parade they thought they were going to hold in Kyiv in March of 2022. And so I worry that if Putin sees America now dropping support to Ukraine, does he calculate or miscalculate that the United States might not come to the assistance of a country such as Estonia? And that's why I very much hope that when I say I fear that Mr. Trump will end assistance to Ukraine, I very much hope he proves me wrong.
Do you think there's any prospect of Donald Trump seriously trying to withdraw America from NATO? I mean, I know it would have to go through Congress, but of course the Republicans control Congress now.
Well, John Bolton, who was Mr. Trump's third national security advisor, thinks it's possible. But here's the thing: Mr. Trump doesn't have to formally withdraw from NATO. He can simply decide that we're going to, pull American troops out or things like that. And this is, again, is a concern. I mean, I think NATO has done much better, and hopefully this will register with the president-elect. I think 3/4 of NATO countries now are meeting the 2% spending goal that was decided back in 2014 by NATO. Although I think they're now beginning to think that goal is not enough; it's got to be raised. But when he thinks about alliances, I worry that he thinks about it too much in terms of money. Yeah. What he doesn't appreciate is that in Afghanistan, 2,400 American soldiers died over 20 years. But alongside them, 1,000 NATO soldiers died from Europe. And they were only in Afghanistan because they were American allies.
Let's finish off with a quick question from Sam. It's got nothing to do with Ukraine at all. But Lee, I know I hope both of you may have a comment on this. I know that this is off topic, but if you have a second, I'm interested in how to get into diplomacy. Is it purely through the civil service, or are there other avenues your panel can suggest? Lee?
Great. Well, first of all, obviously, you've got to read this new book that's just come out, Lessons in Diplomacy.
What's it called again?
Lessons in Diplomacy. It's a really great question, Sam, actually, because one of the key things I actually say in that book is that anybody can be a diplomat. You don't have to be some kind of brain of Britain. You don't have to be somebody who grew up in an international environment. All you have to do is have an interest in foreign countries. You have to have an interest in language. And above all, you have to have an interest in people. And if you fulfill those three requirements, diplomacy may be for you. And everybody should have a go. You just apply through the civil service. One thing to bear in mind is if you don't get in the first time, I didn't get in the first time when I applied to the Foreign Office, you can join the Home Civil Service, say the Department of the Environment, and then you can do a lateral transfer and get in if you're a good civil servant after that. So always keep open your options and always believe, yes, you can become a diplomat. And if you're from an underrepresented group, such as people of different ethnic minority backgrounds, for example, please apply because the Foreign Office is looking for you.
Stephen?
Yes, as Lee said, don't give up if you fail the first time. When I applied for the Foreign Service, the first time I passed the written exam, failed the orals, but they encouraged me to take it again. I tried the next year and I got in. In America, I mean, it's basically civil service or foreign service. The distinction being foreign service officers tend to spend a large percentage of their careers overseas, staffing embassies and consulates. But we do have this rather weird other alternative path, which is that if you can correctly predict who's going to be the next president, most serious presidential candidates have a foreign policy advisory team. You join that team as an advisor, and if your person wins, then you may find yourself being awarded with an ambassadorship or with a senior position at the State Department or at the National Security Council. I'm not sure I would recommend this system to other countries. It does not always work well, but we do have that second route in the United States.
Well, thank you both very much for joining us over the last hour. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. That's Lee Turner, former British ambassador to Ukraine, and Stephen Pfeiffer, former US ambassador to Ukraine.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Iain Dale.
Very good evening. 9 on LBC. There is a new epidemic in this country, and it's called school absences. Now, that doesn't mean children necessarily playing truant from school, but there are around 400,000 ghost children now. Children that should be on the school registers, but just don't turn up. Or if they do turn up, they might turn up for one day in a week or one day in a fortnight. And nobody quite seems to know what's happened to them. So that's my question to you. What has happened to them? How should the high level of school absences be tackled? It's not a simple question to answer because there are so many different aspects to this. Let me run through some of the stories that have appeared over the past week or two. Now, a report by the Education Policy Institute published on Tuesday found that the number of young people in England who did not go to school at all could be more than double that which was previously thought. They compared GP registration records to school enrolment data between 2017 and 2023 to estimate how many children in England do not go to school. It found that up to 400,000 children aged 5 to 15 were not in school in 2023, including about 95,000 pupils who were formally registered as being home educated. Well, OK, you take them out, because at least they are getting an education at home. I would think home education, homeschooling is a fascinating subject. And I think it has, if you draw a graph of how many children are homeschooled, it is going up all of the time for all sorts of different reasons. We might want to go into that. Now, removing homeschool pupils from the overall estimate suggests that about 305,000 children across the country could have missed out on education altogether last year. Now, that's about 2.5 times higher than recent calculations from the Department for Education, which estimated that 117,100 children in England were missing from education at some point in 2022-2023. Now, I'm not sure about the methodology here from the Education Policy Unit, whether you can really translate GP registrations to school absences, but let's assume that they've got a point there. Now, also, and this was from October, almost a third of parents are more relaxed about their children attending school after the COVID pandemic, a survey has revealed, among widespread concern about high pupil absences. In a poll for the charity Parent Kind carried out by YouGov, 31% of parents said they were more relaxed about school attendance now compared with before the pandemic. The proportion rose to 43% for parents of children on free school meals. Seriously? 43% of children on free school meals, their parents think that attending school is a bit of an optional extra. What on earth are these parents doing having children if they don't understand the importance of sending their children to school? I find that completely bewildering. Homeworking parents is another factor here, possibly, because parents who've been working from home since the pandemic are keeping their children off school with them. That's according to the Chief Inspector of Ofsted. Sir Martin Oliver, who's launched his first annual report on education and children's social care in England, said the trend could be seen in lower attendance figures on Fridays. Again, utterly bizarre. Let's just hear why he feels this is such a significant problem.
I think schooling is best done face to face and having social interaction, because it's more than just an imparting of knowledge. There's the social development of interacting with your peers and with adults and different people. I think that's another huge part of education. So let's just be clear that we've seen attendance rocket up after the pandemic, and it's starting to show signs of improvement. But guess what? Same theme again. The most vulnerable and disadvantaged children are the ones who aren't just persistently absent, but many, many, many of them, like 158,000 of them, are missing half of their entire time in school. They're more than 50% absent.
Well, why is this? I'd like to know your theories for this, because I find it completely bewildering that this is happening, that parents can think that school is some sort of optional extra. And I don't know whether you can you really say, well, it's because people have a disadvantaged background? I mean, surely all parents, whatever background they come from, understand the importance of schooling, don't they? Don't you? 0345 6060 973. Connie Muttock joins me, head of policy at the Centre for Young Lives, which has warned this week of the impact which poverty is having on school absences. Connie, very good evening. Thank you for joining us. Just explain to me why poverty would have an impact.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. I mean, you're right to call this an epidemic and to describe the multiple different issues going on here, but poverty is a really significant factor. We know that children on free school meals are actually twice as likely as their peers to be missing out on education. And there are multiple complex things going on here, but one of the big things we heard is that for many families, the cost of going to school is significant. So things like uniforms. We heard an example of two siblings sharing one pair of shoes, and and taking turns on which days to turn up to school because they only had one pair between them, or kids who didn't have a PE kit because their parents couldn't afford it. So on days where they'd have PE, they would miss school because they knew they'd get in trouble. So there are some really kind of significant problems going on with families facing really huge hardship. And this has caused a real significant problem in terms of the rates of school absence we're seeing among those families in free school meals. And you're right that it's... Oh, sorry, go on, Ian.
Sorry to interrupt. I was going to say, well, that I can completely see your logic there, but I could have argued in 1975 that would have been the case as well. And I could say, well, in 1975, child poverty was far worse than it is now, and you would have expected this surely to happen to a far greater scale then than it does now. Doesn't that undermine the theory?
Well, we're missing out one really significant thing that's happened recently, which is the pandemic, which is where we saw lots of these problems rising. So really significant rise since the pandemic, but that was sharpest among families in poverty. And there are multiple reasons for that, but we know we've got record high poverty at the moment. So 4.3 million children living in poverty. We've got 10 kids in every classroom, so a third of kids growing up in poverty. And there are other complex drivers of this going on. So a real rise in poor mental health among children as well. So when parents are dealing with that issue of getting kids to school every day, they're looking at really significant problems that their children are facing that have really grown since the impact of the pandemic, as well as what you're describing as this breakdown in the relationship between families and school.
But this idea that and there is a lot more home working going on at the moment, a lot of people, depending on what their jobs are, might be working from home for 2 or 3 days a week. And according to this research from Ofsted, they're saying, well, they prefer to keep their children off school when they're at home, which I find utterly illogical. You would have thought that if you're working from home, the last thing you want is your 9-year-old daughter or son sort of pestering you for whatever. It seems really weird, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, if you speak to families that had to work from home during the pandemic with their children around, they will say to you that absolutely the last thing they want to do when they're working from home is have their children in the house with them. I think there could be many reasons behind this particular issue of more children being missing from school on Fridays. We know that kids in poverty are actually more likely to be missing school on Fridays, but families on low incomes are less likely to be working from home. So it's unlikely to be the cause here. What you are seeing is everyday parents facing a daily battle with their children, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, trying to get their kids into school. And it can be that just there's that fatigue towards the end of the week among both parents and children around coming into school. And if you're a kid with special educational needs, a child with complex poor mental health, who finds every day going into school a battle, it could be that each day from you've gone into school every day of the week and you get to Friday and you have just had enough. But we don't really understand exactly what's going on here, and it's why we do need to unpick that particular challenge with the increase in school absence on Fridays. But it's certainly a complex picture, and a more complex picture, I think, than we might imagine.
Do you think there is also a phenomenon now of school-aged children, whether we're talking about 5-year-olds or 15-year-olds, just point blank refusing to go to school for all sorts of different reasons? And how, as a parent, it's all very well me sitting here pontificating. I don't have children. I've never had to face this. But it's all very well me saying, well, it's up to parents. That's one of their first responsibilities, to get their children into school. Well, that's all right in theory. But if you've got maybe not just one child, but two, literally screaming at you, I am not going, what do you do? Is there other advice services for parents in this situation?
I mean, that is a problem that many parents are facing, and they've got many other challenges that they're experiencing. So we were talking to one mum who said she was just exhausted, weighing up so many things. Like, she's weighing up how to balance the books and pay the bills. And she's also got this problem of this constant battle of trying to get her kid into school. So you're right, that's absolutely a conversation that families are having every day. We want to see more support for those families. So we want to see schools identifying those families who are facing real problems with absence, and particularly where poverty is a driver of that absence. But also we've seen that infrastructure of support, like Sure Start, which had a really positive impact on families and on kids' attendance in school, has been pulled back in recent years. The funding for that programme has been stripped back during the austerity years, and we really want to see that infrastructure of wraparound support around the family and support from schools rebuilt over the coming years, because you're right, parents are struggling and they need support around this issue.
And of course there is another phenomenon. I'm not sure this would count for many of these 150,000 or 300,000 or whatever figure we can agree on. I know a 15-year-old during the pandemic who felt that she learnt far more in her home environment. I mean, she was still being taught by teachers over Zoom from her school, but she learned far more in that environment than she ever did in a classroom. And she was, I mean, she did go back to school, but she was slightly reluctant because she thought, well, actually, I feel I get a better education when I'm actually at home. Now, I don't know how much of a phenomenon that has been, but it could go some way to explaining these figures.
Well, I think potentially what you're seeing there is actually an example of where we need the school system to shift more towards being an inclusive environment for children and young people. I don't know what that 15-year-old child was going through, but we know that there are some schools where children with special educational needs perform much better than others. So we do need the school environment to be really inclusive of all children. And we know children in poverty, children with poor mental health, children with special educational needs are more likely to be absent, more likely to be excluded from school, and more likely to have challenges with school. So it's also about making sure that the school environment is really leaning in and wrapping around that child and making sure that they get the best out of their education, as well as the kids that, love being in school and perform very well in school. We want an education system that gets the best out of everyone. And that's why the inclusion agenda is really important.
What about homeschooling, which seems to have built in popularity over the last few years? I can remember when I first started presenting shows on LBC back in 2010, I remember the first phone-in I did on this, thinking, this is ridiculous. How does any parent think they can know enough about O-level physics or GCSE, shows my age, GCSE physics to be able to teach them about this? And I had parent after parent coming on, explaining how they did it, why it worked, and how their children benefited from it. And virtually every time I've done a phone-in on this since, I start the hour essentially saying, I think this is ridiculous. I think I did describe it once as tantamount to child abuse, which is possibly going over the top. But I get to the end of the hour and I hear these inspirational parents telling me how they've done it. And then I sometimes talk to the kids and they also come on the phone and say, well, I don't regret this for a moment. And I suppose after the pandemic, when the parents have got used to it, they feel more confident in doing it.
I'm sure there are those children who have really fantastic experiences of homeschooling. I think the challenge is that we want school to serve those children really well. And we also have some circumstances where some parents are encouraged to take their kids off the school roll because they might be the naughtier kids, the poor performing kids. So we do want to make sure that every school is welcoming those kids onto their school role and serving those kids well. And we need consistency, and we need to kind of have a real track record of how kids are being educated, what their outcomes are. So it might be right for some individual kids, but for the vast majority of children, school is the best place that they can be in. And for too many children, as you've said at the top of this discussion, too many children, hundreds of thousands of children are just missing from education entirely. And you're right that those EPI statistics, they do say in that report, we just don't know how many children there are. There could be far more many than we think because we don't have a register of how many children are missing out on their education. So we absolutely need that so that we know who's missing school and what's going on for those children, because it's a real safeguarding risk. Those kids that are not in school, that are not known to services, that are potentially at risk of exploitation and harm in their communities because they're not spending time in their most vital and valuable resource for their future, which is their education.
I was going to thank you and say goodbye, but I've got this WhatsApp message from Tony, which I want to read out to you. He says, your guest might not understand, but for me, it is obvious. Some, not all parents, are just not very good. I'm being polite. And the longer, as a society, we continue not to call them out about their shortcomings, the worse this problem will get. He's got a point, hasn't he?
I'm not sure how much it helps to come down on parents in that way, in a sense that I think parents are grappling with harder problems than ever, and parents need more support than ever. And if we're really focused on who we want those really strong outcomes for, which is the child, we need to understand that we need an infrastructure that really helps families and helps parents cope with what is a really significant and challenging situation at the moment. I've said it before, but record high poverty, really high poor mental health among children and young people, many parents struggling.
Sorry, you keep saying record high poverty. And I don't want to get back to the definition of relative versus absolute poverty, but are you seriously telling me that you believe poverty in this country is worse than it was when my father was a child in the 1930s, when if he or his brothers or sisters had said to his parents, oh, we're not going to school today, we've got mental health problems, his mother and father would have said, you'll get down to that school or you'll get a damn good thrashing?
I mean, there's absolutely plenty of children living in poverty who are turning up to school. This is not the majority of children in poverty, but there are 4 million children living in poverty at the moment. And there are record high numbers of families going to food banks. So really experiencing the highest level of deprivation where they can't afford the basic essentials. So they are in a really difficult situation at the moment. But like you say, there are plenty of parents and families living in poverty that are really, really focused on getting their kids in school, but it may be that they face some of those barriers like affording school uniforms, like affording transport, like affording PE kits and school trips.
Well, I would say again, all of those things applied to school kids when I went to school decades ago, but it does seem to be worse now, and we'll spend the next 45 minutes or so talking about that. Connie, really good conversation. Thank you very much indeed. That's Connie Muttock, Head of Policy at the Centre for Young Lives.
Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
22 minutes past 9. We're asking, who are these ghost children? I mean, are there any parents listening to this programme who think, yeah, that's kind of my child and it's my fault? Look, I'd love to hear from you. You don't have to give your real name. But I think a lot of people are struggling to understand this phenomenon because particularly if you are a parent or a grandparent, maybe from an older generation, you just don't understand this idea that school is some sort of optional extra. It genuinely is not. You cannot hope to succeed in adulthood if you don't take your education seriously, or if as a parent you don't take your child's education seriously. You're doing them no favours in the long run. Because our society is still governed, I'm afraid, by exam results. And you may think, well, that's incredibly unfair. But that is just the way it is. And whether parents like it or not, they have to deal with it. And if their children do take the attitude that they know better than their parents, well, I'm sorry, that is part of a parental responsibility to exert the discipline that children need. We often talk about this in terms of the obesity crisis. We've lost our moral compass if we don't understand the concept of personal responsibility. We've lost our moral compass if we don't understand the concept of parental responsibility. And if you don't think that as a parent you have a responsibility to get your child in school 5 days a week, then I'm afraid you should never have become a parent in the first place. And you might think, well, that sounds really heartless and cruel. But think about the consequences. Think about your 16-year-old when they get to take their exams and they're not in a position to do it because they haven't been in school for half their school life. That is your fault, isn't it? Ty is a new caller in Swansea. Hello, Ty.
Hi. So as much as I agree with you on it is part of a parent's responsibility to get a child into school, a lot of kids just simply can't go. I know I struggled a lot, especially because, like's been mentioned, the epidemic severely impacted kids. And I know that people are aware of that, but I don't think they realize how much it actually impacted children. I mean, if you think about it, I started year 7 when COVID happened, and I was dropped straight into GCSE straight after, having no real friend groups because I hadn't been in year 7 long enough to have made new friends, and then being thrown straight into GCSEs when I hadn't been in school at all because I wasn't allowed. It was so insanely stressful. I wasn't able to go for a good year and a half. I didn't go to school because it was a safety risk. But also the fact you said about how not being in school would impact grades. I know I was very lucky to still manage to do so well, but I got 8 A's. I passed everything.
Well done, you.
Thank you.
Shall I tell you what I got?
Oh, yeah, go for it.
I failed 2, physics and biology, and I got 3 B's and 3 C's.
Well, yeah. See, you failed some, and you're still.
Yeah, I did.
I
got. Not only did I fail, Ty, I got ungraded in physics. Because I was so bad. And I went to school every day.
Exactly. So
I'm rather
I feel
defeating my argument here, aren't I?
Yeah, like as much as school is important, if kids can't make it into school, there are plenty of ways for them to learn outside of like just going into school. I mean, we had it during the epidemic, and as much as a bunch of kids did fail, it's going to happen either way. Like, you can't expect everyone to do amazingly after such huge impacted things.
Can I ask you a personal question?
Yeah.
You said you didn't go to school for 18 months.
Yeah.
Explain to me exactly why.
I had severe anxiety and other mental health issues. I could not get into a class. I was often having to go to hospital straight from school. I wasn't allowed in at one point because I could not be in school without completely, I couldn't do it. And I know that's the same for a lot of other kids because the pandemic affected everyone so much, and they weren't used to being in larger social settings anymore or having this sort of environment. And I feel like, as much as what you were saying before about, well, it was the same like in the past, people are more focused on mental health now and figuring out what's actually better for people rather than just being like, oh, deal with it, you know?
And what reaction did you get, A, from parents and B, from your school?
They were all really concerned, and for a while it was just the forcing in, but that made it a lot worse. It didn't help. You can't just push someone into doing something and expect it to work. For some kids it will, but for a lot it won't, and you have to find a way around it. And I know school support systems are completely overcrowded. They can't cope with how much is going on and how many kids need the support. So I feel rather than blaming the parents and telling them they should just force their kids into school, it should be finding a way that works for the kids as well, that also focuses on their mental health.
What do you want to do when you leave school?
I'm in college right now, and I'm going to try go into architecture.
Wow.
Yeah.
Got no idea how you even get into that, but it sounds terribly forbidding to me.
It depends if you do the research.
So you're doing your A-levels at the moment?
Yeah.
And which subjects are you doing?
I'm currently just doing built environment. This is another thing that goes on. So because of my struggle to get into school, I almost got kicked out of college and had to switch to doing one A-level instead of multiple because the college couldn't support me, and I still really struggle with my mental health. A big part of it is because of COVID and how much that affected me and the way I live my life and what I was used to and how I grew up.
You're 16 years old, yeah?
Yeah.
I mean, I can't remember the last time I talked to a 16-year-old who sounded as eloquent and confident as you do. And you should take a huge amount of solace for whatever mental health problems you've had or maybe still have to an extent. What I think everyone listening to you talking will say, well, your ability to speak will get you a long way in life.
Thank you.
Well, good luck with the architecture, and hope you do really well in your A-levels. Thank you very much indeed, Ty. What's an amazing call, because you see, what Ty has done there is actually, without being combative, challenged a lot of what I was saying in advance of that, and credit to her for doing that. Let's go to Lisa, who's a new caller in Chiswick. Hello, Lisa.
Hello.
Would you think less of me if I told you I stayed last night at the Premier Inn on the Hogarth roundabout?
No.
What would you like to say, Lisa?
So I would like to give my opinion on, well, I have two children, you see. I've got one who's 7 and I have one who's in his 20s now. And so already going through the school system, it's left me very disillusioned. And so with my oldest 20-odd-year-old son, I was very much of the opinion, you have to go to school. And I was adamant. And he never missed school. You know, no sickness, nothing could keep him from school. And I just really expected the school system to work and do its job, which is to educate your child. I really trusted them. And actually, he came away with not one GCSE. In the end, it turned out he had severe dyslexia, which wasn't caught until he was in college. So I feel like the school system completely failed him. And I feel like, so with my younger son now, I'm not so pushing for him to be adamant that he has to go in every single day. I'm much more caring about his well-being, him and his mental health. I'm also aware that I'm in the city of London.
How do these conversations go? Does he just say, "Mum, don't feel like going to school today," and you say, "Well, that's okay, darling, you don't have to"?
No. Sorry, can I just say one more thing? I'm in inner city London, and also the influence of the other children can have a massive impact. And there's a lot of not so nice characters. So it almost makes me want to actually homeschool him. I think that a lot of the children, it depends where you live as well, but a lot of the children come in with, bad attitudes, they're bullies. And so you feel like you're protecting your child by keeping them at home. So sometimes with my younger son, he may be very upset. He might be crying, saying, that he's not made friends, or, people have been mean to him in the school. And so then I would keep him at home,
But we all had that at school. I mean, do you really think you're doing him a favour by doing that?
Well, like with the lady before, I think sometimes it depends on the child. Some are very studious and some will benefit from being at school every single day. But the world isn't necessarily like that now. So, yes, I'm going to ensure he still gets his education. And that's what I'm trying to say, that even with my older son, he went in every day and still didn't get an education. So with this younger one now, he 100% will get his education because I will ensure it.
Well, he won't if he doesn't go to school.
Well, he already is. He's excelling, regardless the fact that his attendance rate isn't that great, because I'm making sure he has everything he needs to survive this harsh world by ensuring that I'm, giving him that emotional support at home that I think the schools lack nowadays. I don't really know what's gone wrong in the school system, to be honest. I think it's a whole, I think there's a lot to it. Society, the school system, it doesn't really feed kids' needs nowadays.
Well, if you look at particularly the London school system, which 30 or 40 years ago was an absolute basket case, London schools are now some of the best in the country. And you look at today, it was revealed that Britain has the best science and maths attainment levels of any country in the world apart from 4 Asian countries. And sometimes we sort of almost talk ourselves down and think that we have a terrible education system. Then you see statistics like that and you think, well, actually, we're not that bad. And of course, look, every school will have its challenges. That is quite clear. You can see that and you hear it from parents and children all the time. But I still think that if a child almost regards, or if a parent regards school as an optional extra, that is not going to do the child any good in the long term. But Lisa, thank you very much for your call. We'll take more of your calls in a moment. Who and where are these 300,000 or 400,000 so-called ghost children?
Iain Dale on LBC.
9:48. Text here says poverty is the biggest reason children miss school. And the council's answer is to punish truancy is to fine parents. That's crazy. And Mickey says school doesn't need to be 5 days a week. A lot of parents work 3 or 4 days a week. Why not the schools? Well, I think the answer to that would be that everyone sort of says, well, there's not enough time for enough history in the curriculum or enough maths. Well, you take it down to 4 days a week. And you're going to have to cut out some of the subjects so your child then doesn't get a rounded education. Now, you could say, well, maybe have longer school days, I suppose, but there would be a huge fight about that because teachers certainly wouldn't want to do that. So I'm not really sure whether taking it down from 5 days to 4 days would be a good idea. Well, in fact, I am sure it wouldn't be a good idea. Lily is a first-time caller in Dartford. Hi, Lily. Lily?
Hi there. Hi.
What would you like to say?
So I feel like I've got a little bit of a unique perspective on this. I was homeschooled as a primary school age child. My parents took me out of school when I was around in about year 2, which is pretty much like 6, 7 years old. And I was homeschooled through my primary age right up to secondary school. And as far as I was concerned, looking back on that part of my life, it was the happiest I'd ever been. I was, spending every day with my parents and my family. I was spending every day learning because it was what I really loved to do as a kid. And I was lucky that my mum was able to foster that in me. And so as I grew up, in my head, or what I had as my future career was to do exactly what my mum did, but on kind of, I guess, a larger scale in a classroom of my own with children of my own. And then so I've been a primary school teacher for about 5 years now, and I have absolutely no qualms with some of the things that some of these parents are saying that have come on the show that I've been listening to for a little while now. It is, and I find it really sad because a lot of parents, I think, assume that teachers maybe perhaps aren't doing some of their job properly, or they're not doing, enough for some of their children. And the truth is that as teachers, we are doing everything we can. The problem is that we are not just teachers. We are social workers. We're admin assistants. We are, sometimes parents, these children who come into school without the right clothes.
That is a difference. That is a difference, isn't it? I mean, I suppose there was always some of those aspects to the job of a teacher, but not to the extent that it is now.
No, and it's the class sizes as well. Speaking from personal experience, the last class I just had 33 children in it, and 10 of those children had what we call educational healthcare plans, which means they had real specific needs that I had to cater to on a daily basis. And I had them for 2 years. So I had 2 years of essentially making 6 different lessons plans for every single lesson I taught. And that is a real grueling process. And as much as I did everything I can for those children, but I would have no doubt in the world that there were some parents sitting at home thinking that not enough is happening for my child, and I would completely agree. And it's really sad as a teacher, because I think you go in every day hoping to do your best, and you know that when you have that many children, there is always going to be someone who you can't help. And we none of us ever come into this profession with the thought that we don't like children, we don't want to be here for that reason. But things get in our way, and ultimately the trust that parents have in us, I think, has failed massively. But I think it comes from government. They don't trust us, and we can see that through all the problems that we've had with Ofsted, all the problems that we've had with shrinking into academies and becoming businesses. We've stopped having that level of, like you said, when you were a child, school was really revered as this place you should be for learning, and I think the schools aren't quite that anymore. And it's a shame. It is a shame. And I think it's really strange, because I've only been in the profession for 5 years. I am myself only 25, but I really do think that I am coming to the end of that career. And it's a shame, because I went in with real drive, real love for it. And it's just not come out that way.
What would you do instead?
That's a big question. Personally, I'm really passionate about providing the sorts of curriculums that the parents have been talking about, that are personalised for children, that really do take into account their social situation, their personal experiences, and their what we call cultural capital a lot in education. If you've heard the phrase, this kind of concept of giving children power through experience, that is what I'm passionate about. It's what I'd like to do. But there aren't that many jobs for it either, from what I can see. And again, it comes a lot from government. I think one of your callers previously mentioned that the curriculum is boring, it's narrow, and it is. We have to teach to a specification that ensures that our schools and our classes get results. And that, for me, coming from a homeschool background, is not what education's about.
I wish we'd done this phone in a week ago, because we had the schools minister on Cross Question on Tuesday, and I'd have loved to have put some of these points to her.
Yeah, funnily enough, I was listening to it.
Oh, were you? Oh, why didn't you phone in?
Yeah. I was driving. It wasn't the right time, but no, I appreciate it.
Listen, Lily, it's a great call. Thank you very much indeed for that. Lisa says, "Oh, Iain, I wish I'd heard the last 50 minutes. Well, the good news, Lisa, is that you can listen to the last 50 minutes. In fact, you can do so right now on Global Player. And you can also catch up on the whole show podcast, which will be up by 11 o'clock if Corey gets his finger out. She says, I work in a large secondary school and believe the whole system needs an overhaul. One size does not fit all, and the GCSE grades are all that is focused on. We need more vocational courses, more choice, and less focus on what you've got to get in your exams. Love the show, Lisa in Hove." Thank you very much, Lisa. Clive has called in from Miami. Hello, Clive.
Hello, how are you?
I'm all right, thank you.
Now, I'm phoning in. I've got a granddaughter who refuses to go to school. I don't know what it's about. She's 12 years old, and her mother and her father let her get away with it. We, in the family, and my daughter, another daughter who's about 10 years or 12 years older than the one who's got the child, is astounded by it. We're all astounded by it. And I think it's social media, and I do believe the lack of parents able to in any way discipline their children. I mean, if she were my child, she'd be taken by the scruff of her neck and taken to school every day.
But have you thought, Clive, and I'm sure you have, but have you thought that there may be some big issue where there is maybe one child who's making her life an absolute misery?
No. So what? We know what it was like.
You can't say so
we know
what.
how dreadful some. Well, you have to live with it. We all have to live with it. When I was at school and someone behaved any way badly like that, it was drummed out of them. And by the time they left school, they were behaving like normal human beings. Young people are allowed to get away with absolute nonsense as far as I'm concerned. I'm sorry, I'm so intolerant of this because I feel my granddaughter is getting no education. My daughter claims homeschooling. Well, I've watched it and seen what happens. She's on social media. She's not learning anything when she's on what it's supposedly on Zoom. I mean, it's a joke, but it's a serious joke because she's not going to be educated. And I don't think
what happened to I don't know how old she is, but what happened during COVID?
In COVID, she was kept home or taken into school some of the time because my daughter was a teacher then. And as a teacher, I just don't understand it. I don't understand how they've given in to her because she's the one who's suffering. She's going to end up with no education. And I don't mean no exams. Plenty of people didn't do well at the exams. There's much more to school than that, as you've said before.
Well,
I'm horrified by it, and I think social media
and presumably
has a great deal to blame for it.
Presumably, you've had this discussion with your daughter
regularly.
How does that go, Clive?
If it's on the phone, I get the phone put down on me. I'll never talk to you again. I know.
Shall I put the phone down on you, Clive?
She's not my daughter, I'm told, but I feel I can't stand by and see it. She's going to end up with nil education.
Well, I'm not going to sit here and pontificate and offer advice because how can I possibly know the situation? I mean, I'm sure that your daughter has your granddaughter's best interests at heart. She is obviously dealing with it in a different way to that which you would. But bear with it and don't fall out with your daughter over it. I mean, look, families fall out over all sorts of things. But I would have to say to you that it's not worth falling out about. Thank you very much indeed, Clive. Well, thanks for all of your calls and messages this evening and throughout the week. I'll be back on Monday evening from 7. If you missed any of this evening's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, where you can also pause and rewind live radio, as well as listen to a range of podcasts, including the Whole Show podcast, which Lisa will be listening to this evening. Now, download now for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. 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 Head to globalplayer.com.